"Officer, that Ferrari didn't belong to him." The woman's voice cut across the quiet morning like a blade, sharp enough to make every conversation in front of Sinclair Dynamics stop at once. Heads turned in perfect unison. Coffee cups paused halfway to waiting lips. Security guards instinctively straightened their backs. Even the revolving glass doors seemed to slow, as if the entire building itself wanted to witness what came next. Marcus Reed stood beside the deep crimson Ferrari with one hand resting lightly on the driver's door. He neither flinched nor frowned. The polished paint reflected the Manhattan skyline, streaks of pale sunlight gliding across the curved body like liquid fire. The engine had only been off for a few seconds, its warmth still rising into the cool October air. Marcus quietly pressed the key fob, and the mirrors folded inward with a soft mechanical click. He looked exactly like a man finishing an ordinary morning commute. Victoria Sinclair saw something entirely different. Standing at the bottom of the marble staircase leading into the headquarters of Sinclair Dynamics, she narrowed her eyes before lowering the phone from her ear. Her cream-colored designer coat moved gently in the breeze, and expensive sunglasses rested on her head despite the gray morning sky. She had spent 20 years building the reputation of being the smartest executive in every room she entered. She trusted her instincts more than reports, more than advisors, sometimes even more than facts. And at that moment, every instinct told her the same story. A black man in a simple charcoal jacket, well-worn leather shoes, and no visible company badge could not possibly have arrived in a Ferrari worth more than most people's homes. Her expression hardened. "Don't let him leave," she instructed the nearest security officer without taking her eyes off Marcus. "The police are already on their way." A ripple spread through the employees gathering outside the entrance. Some whispered. Others discreetly raised their phones. The scene felt strangely familiar, another public spectacle that would undoubtedly find its way onto social media before lunch. Marcus noticed the cameras. He noticed the security guards approaching from opposite directions. He noticed the curious stares measuring everything from his clothes to the watch resting quietly beneath his sleeve. Yet the only thing that changed was his breathing. Slow, even, measured. One of the guards stopped several feet away. "Sir," he said cautiously, "we're going to need you to stay right here." Marcus gave a small nod. Of course. The simplicity of the answer unsettled the young guard more than any argument could have. People who were hiding something usually talked too much. They protested. They demanded lawyers. They accused everyone around them. Marcus simply stood there, hands visible, calm enough that the silence around him began to feel heavier than the accusations themselves. Victoria crossed the sidewalk in confident strides, her heels clicking against the stone with perfect rhythm. Every employee instinctively stepped aside to clear her path. She stopped only a few feet from Marcus and looked from his face to the Ferrari before shaking her head with visible disappointment. "You picked the wrong place," she said coldly. "This isn't the neighborhood where people overlook stolen luxury cars." Marcus met her gaze without the slightest hint of anger. "Good morning to you too." His voice carried no sarcasm, only quiet composure. Somehow that irritated Victoria even more. She folded her arms. "You don't seem very worried." Marcus glanced briefly toward the towering glass building behind her, sunlight now spilling across its mirrored surface. "Should I be?" For just a moment, Victoria hesitated. His confidence didn't match the picture she had already painted in her mind. But certainty quickly returned. Sirens echoed faintly somewhere beyond the intersection, growing louder with every passing second. Employees leaned closer. More phones appeared above shoulders. The city continued moving around them, taxis rolling past, cyclists weaving through traffic, strangers unaware that the next few minutes would quietly reshape more than one person's understanding of power, judgment, and truth. Before we continue, if you enjoy powerful stories that reveal the strength of the human spirit and the choices that shape our lives, subscribe to Narralight. Every story has a lesson, every choice has a consequence, and sometimes the smallest moment changes everything. Now, let's see what happens next. The police cruisers rolled quietly to the curb, their flashing lights reflecting across the Ferrari's flawless finish and the towering glass walls of Sinclair Dynamics. The conversations outside the building faded into murmurs as two officers stepped onto the sidewalk with calm professionalism. Neither hurried. Neither appeared eager to make assumptions. Officer Daniel Brooks adjusted the small notebook tucked beneath his arm before looking from Victoria Sinclair to Marcus Reed. Years on the force had taught him that the loudest voice was not always the most accurate one. Victoria stepped forward immediately. "Thank goodness you are here," she said, her confidence returning the instant she saw the uniforms. "This man drove up in that Ferrari. He does not belong here, and I believe the vehicle is stolen." Officer Brooks nodded politely without writing anything down. "What makes you believe that, ma'am?" Victoria blinked. The question caught her slightly off guard. "Because it is obvious." Brooks waited. She continued, "I have been the chief executive officer of this company for nearly a decade. I know the people who belong here. I know every executive who owns luxury vehicles. I have never seen him before." The officer glanced toward Marcus. "Sir, may I have your name?" "Marcus Reed. Would you mind showing me your driver's license?" Marcus reached slowly into the inside pocket of his jacket and handed over a perfectly organized leather wallet. His movements remained deliberate, careful enough that no one watching could mistake his intentions. Brooks examined the identification for several seconds before handing it back. Everything appeared valid. Nothing raised concern. The second officer circled the Ferrari once, checking the license plate without touching the vehicle. Employees whispered among themselves, trying to read the officer's expressions like stock market investors watching a ticker. Victoria folded her arms tighter. "You should also check whether he actually has the keys." Marcus quietly lifted the key fob in his palm. Without saying a word, he pressed a button. The headlights flashed once. A soft electronic tone answered from inside the vehicle. Several people exchanged uncertain glances. Victoria quickly recovered. Anyone can duplicate a key nowadays. Marcus did not respond. Instead, he slipped the key back into his pocket and looked toward the building's enormous entrance where polished chrome reflected the growing crowd. It was almost 9 o'clock. Employees arriving for work had slowed to a near standstill, curiosity proving stronger than punctuality. Brooks noticed Marcus checking the time. "Do you have somewhere you need to be?" Marcus gave a faint smile. "I have a meeting upstairs." Victoria let out a short laugh that carried just enough volume for everyone nearby to hear. "That is impossible." Marcus looked at her. "Is it?" She shook her head with absolute certainty. "Every executive meeting is on my calendar. I approve every visitor who walks into this building. There is no meeting involving you." The words settled heavily over the crowd. Some employees nodded in agreement. Others remained strangely unconvinced. Marcus had not once raised his voice. He had not argued. He had not offered excuses. He simply stood with the patience of someone waiting for a train that was guaranteed to arrive on schedule. Officer Brooks turned toward the second officer, who had just finished speaking quietly into the radio attached to his shoulder. The younger officer leaned closer and whispered something almost too softly to hear. Brooks' eyes narrowed for only a moment before returning to Marcus. "Sir," Brooks asked evenly, "would you mind if dispatch verifies the vehicle registration?" Marcus answered immediately. "Please do." The confidence in those two words hung in the crisp morning air far longer than anyone expected. Victoria smiled to herself, convinced that the verification would finally end the discussion. Around them, dozens of employees watched in complete silence, unaware that the truth moving toward them was far larger than the ownership of a Ferrari. The silence stretched just long. Enough for everyone to hear the faint crackle coming from Officer Brooks's shoulder radio. He rested one hand near the device without taking his eyes off Marcus. Around them, dozens of polished office windows reflected a crowd that seemed frozen in place, every face waiting for a single answer. The breeze carried the smell of roasted coffee from a nearby cafe, mixing with the clean scent of fresh pavement after the city's early morning street washing. Somewhere across the avenue, a delivery truck released its air brakes with a sharp hiss, but no one outside Sinclair Dynamics paid it any attention. Every eye remained fixed on the man beside the Ferrari. Dispatch finally responded. The radio came alive with a calm voice. "Vehicle registration confirmed. Plate number matches the identification number. Registered owner." A brief pause followed while another screen loaded. Victoria smiled confidently before the sentence had even finished. She folded her arms tighter, already preparing herself for the apology she believed Marcus would soon owe everyone present. The officer listening to the radio remained expressionless. "Registered owner is Marcus Allen Reed." The words landed softly, almost casually, yet they seemed to empty the air from the entire sidewalk. A few employees instinctively lowered their phones. Someone quietly whispered, "Wait." "What?" Officer Brooks looked up from the radio toward Marcus, then toward the Ferrari once again. There was no confusion in the system. No stolen vehicle report. No ownership dispute. Every record matched perfectly. Brooks nodded once. "Thank you, dispatch." He clipped the radio back onto his shoulder. Victoria stared at him. "That cannot be right." Brooks answered evenly. "According to the Department of Motor Vehicles, the vehicle belongs to Mr. Reed." She shook her head immediately. "There has to be some mistake." Marcus remained exactly where he had been since the officers arrived. He neither smiled nor celebrated. Instead, he quietly adjusted the cuff of his jacket as if ownership of a Ferrari were the least remarkable thing happening that morning. The restraint unsettled several people watching more than any dramatic reaction could have. Victoria stepped closer to the officers. "You should verify it again. Criminals manipulate registrations all the time." Brooks met her eyes politely. "Ma'am, if we had evidence of fraud, we would investigate it. Right now we do not." Her jaw tightened. The certainty she had carried only minutes earlier began developing tiny cracks. They were almost invisible, but they were there. One of the younger employees standing near the entrance looked toward Marcus with growing curiosity instead of suspicion. Another quietly lowered his phone, embarrassed that he had been recording someone who had done nothing wrong. Marcus noticed neither reaction. His attention drifted toward the massive digital clock inside the lobby. 8:58. 2 minutes until 9. He exhaled slowly before speaking for the first time in nearly a minute. "Officer Brooks." "Yes, sir." "Am I free to go?" Brooks answered without hesitation. "As far as we can determine, you have committed no offense." Victoria interrupted immediately. "He still does not belong here." Marcus turned toward her, his expression unchanged. "You seem very certain of that." "Because I know every important person who walks into this building." Marcus studied the towering headquarters behind her, sunlight now pouring across the silver company logo mounted above the entrance. For just an instant, something almost resembling amusement flickered across his face before disappearing again. "That is an interesting statement." Victoria misunderstood the calmness for surrender. She lifted her chin confidently. "Whatever game you are playing, it ends here." Marcus slipped one hand into his jacket pocket and looked once more toward the revolving doors. "Actually," he said quietly, almost to himself, "it is about to begin." At that exact moment, the front entrance opened again. A black luxury sedan rolled silently toward the curb, stopping with practiced precision directly in front of Marcus instead of the executive entrance reserved for the company's leadership. The driver stepped out first, followed by a distinguished gray-haired man carrying a slim leather portfolio. The instant he saw Marcus, he straightened his tie, walked past Victoria without so much as a glance, and spoke words that caused every nearby conversation to disappear. "Good morning, Mr. Reed. The board is assembled and waiting for you upstairs." The words settled over the crowd with a weight that no one could ignore. Even the soft hum of morning traffic seemed to fade beneath the silence. The gray-haired man stopped exactly one step in front of Marcus and extended his hand with quiet respect. "I apologize for the delay, Mr. Reed. The other board members arrived early." Marcus accepted the handshake with an easy smile. "No problem, Richard. It has been an interesting morning." Richard Lawson, the senior partner from one of the country's most respected corporate law firms, gave a slight nod before noticing the police officers and the growing audience surrounding them. His eyes moved briefly toward Victoria Sinclair, whose confident posture had begun to stiffen. "Has something happened?" he asked. Before Marcus could answer, Victoria stepped forward. "Richard, I am glad you are here. There seems to be some misunderstanding. This individual claims he has business inside my company." Richard looked at her with visible confusion. "Your company?" Victoria answered immediately. "I am the chief executive officer." Richard remained polite, but his expression did not change. "Yes, you are the chief executive officer." He paused just long enough for the next sentence to settle with deliberate precision. "Mr. Reed is expected by the board of directors." A murmur spread through the employees standing outside the entrance. Victoria blinked once, certain she had misunderstood. "Expected?" Richard nodded. "The special board meeting begins at 9 o'clock. She frowned. "I scheduled no special meeting." Richard carefully opened the leather portfolio tucked beneath his arm and removed a sealed envelope bearing the company crest. The meeting was called under Article 8 of the shareholder agreement at the request of the majority voting interest. Victoria stared at the envelope without reaching for it. That is impossible. Richard did not argue. He simply offered the document toward her. The notice was delivered electronically yesterday evening and by courier this morning. Her fingers hesitated before taking the envelope. She broke the seal with far less confidence than she had shown only minutes earlier. Several pages slid into her hand. Her eyes moved quickly across the legal language before suddenly stopping. The color in her face faded almost imperceptibly. Officer Brooks watched quietly from several feet away. He no longer looked at Marcus as the subject of an investigation. Instead, he observed the unfolding conversation with the detached curiosity of someone witnessing a misunderstanding resolve itself in unexpected fashion. Victoria looked up from the paperwork. This acquisition cannot be finalized yet. Richard answered calmly. The Securities and Exchange Commission filings were completed before the market opened this morning. Every required approval has been recorded. She turned another page, her breathing noticeably slower now. Around her, employees exchanged uncertain glances. Nobody whispered anymore. Nobody laughed. The certainty that had filled the plaza less than 10 minutes earlier had quietly disappeared, replaced by cautious silence. Marcus remained standing beside the Ferrari, hands relaxed at his sides, making no effort to interrupt or embarrass anyone. The sunlight reflected softly across the windshield, casting shifting patterns onto the marble entrance behind him. Richard closed his portfolio. Mr. Reed, the board requested that I escort you upstairs as soon as you arrived. Marcus glanced briefly toward Victoria before answering. I believe we should give Miss Sinclair a moment. Richard inclined his head respectfully. Of course. Victoria slowly lowered the papers. Her voice had lost the sharp certainty it carried earlier. Who exactly are you? Marcus met her eyes for several long seconds. There was no satisfaction in his expression, no trace of revenge, only quiet patience. That, he said gently, is probably a better question than asking who belongs in the parking lot. No one spoke. The revolving glass doors turned slowly behind them as employees entering the building suddenly seemed careful not to interrupt the moment. The polished company logo shimmered beneath the morning sun while the enormous digital clock inside the lobby changed to exactly 9 o'clock. Upstairs, an entire boardroom waited. Downstairs, the assumptions that had shaped the last 20 minutes had already begun to collapse, one quiet truth at a time. Victoria lowered the papers slowly, as though they had become heavier with every line she had read. The marble plaza that usually echoed with hurried footsteps before the opening bell had fallen into an almost uncomfortable silence. Employees who had been eager to capture an embarrassing moment on their phones now quietly slipped the devices back into their pockets. Nobody wanted to be noticed. Nobody wanted to be remembered as part of what had just happened. Marcus glanced toward Officer Brooks before offering a small, respectful nod. Thank you for handling this professionally, officer. Brooks returned the gesture. I appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Reed. There was genuine respect in his voice now, but Marcus did not seem interested in the change of tone. He had not been waiting for validation. He simply believed every conversation deserved dignity, even when it began with suspicion. Brooks looked briefly toward Victoria. Ma'am, unless there is another matter to report, our involvement here is finished. She opened her mouth as if to object, but no words came. The officers walked back toward their cruisers without urgency, leaving behind an awkward stillness that felt somehow louder than the sirens had moments before. Richard Lawson checked his watch. Mr. Reed, we should head upstairs. The independent directors have been waiting for nearly 10 minutes. Marcus nodded, then paused before taking his first step toward the entrance. His attention shifted to one of the younger security guards standing near the revolving doors. The guard looked barely 25, his shoulders tense with uncertainty. Earlier, he had obeyed every instruction without question, positioning himself directly in Marcus's path. Now he seemed unable to meet Marcus's eyes. Marcus walked over with calm, measured steps. The young guard immediately straightened. Sir, Marcus gently interrupted him. You were doing your job. The guard looked surprised. I should have asked more questions before assuming. Marcus smiled softly. We all make decisions with the information we have. What matters is whether we are willing to learn when new information arrives. The guard nodded slowly, the tension easing from his shoulders. Thank you, sir. Several employees standing nearby heard every word. None of them expected kindness. Most had anticipated anger, demands for apologies, perhaps even immediate consequences. Instead, they witnessed something far quieter. Marcus had every opportunity to humiliate someone who held no real power over the situation, yet he chose not to. Richard watched the exchange with quiet admiration before saying, "Your father used to respond exactly like that." Marcus's expression softened for the first time that morning. He believed people remembered grace longer than revenge. Richard smiled. He was right. Victoria remained frozen several yards away, still holding the shareholder documents with both hands. She watched the brief conversation unfold without understanding it. The calmness unsettled her more deeply than any harsh words could have. She had spent years negotiating billion-dollar contracts, navigating hostile takeovers, and managing difficult investors. She knew how powerful people behaved when they finally gained the upper hand. They reminded everyone in the room who had won. Marcus did none of that. It made her question everything she thought she understood about influence. The revolving doors turned slowly as Marcus and Richard entered the building together. Warm light spilled across the polished stone floor inside the lobby, where a receptionist immediately stood from her desk. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," she said with a welcoming smile. "The boardroom is prepared." Marcus thanked her by name, something that caused two nearby employees to exchange surprised glances. He knew the receptionist. He knew the security staff. He spoke to everyone with the same calm respect. Victoria stepped into the lobby a few seconds later, still trying to process the morning's events. She noticed employees looking at Marcus differently now, not because of the Ferrari, not because of wealth. They were watching someone who treated every person in the building as though they mattered. As the elevator door slid open with a quiet chime, Richard held one side while Marcus stepped inside. Just before the doors closed, Marcus looked back toward Victoria, whose reflection shimmered across the polished steel panels. His voice remained gentle, almost reflective. "The hardest thing to recover after making a wrong judgment is not a reputation. It is the trust of the people who witnessed it." The elevator doors closed softly, carrying him toward the boardroom while Victoria remained standing in the silent lobby, holding papers that had changed the ownership of her company, yet realizing the greatest change that morning had nothing to do with shares at all. The elevator climbed in complete silence, its polished steel walls reflecting four people who seemed lost in entirely different thoughts. Richard Lawson reviewed a folder one final time. Two independent directors stood quietly behind him, exchanging brief glances without speaking. Marcus simply watched the numbers above the doors change one floor at a time. His reflection remained calm, almost detached, as though he had expected every unexpected turn this morning long before the sun rose over Manhattan. A soft chime announced the executive floor. The doors opened to reveal a hallway lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Morning light spilled across dark walnut floors, catching framed photographs that chronicled nearly 50 years of Sinclair dynamics. Past chief executives smiled from polished portraits. Groundbreaking ceremonies, ribbon cuttings, charitable foundations, and global expansion milestones stretched across the walls like carefully arranged memories. Marcus slowed for just a moment to study them. "Your father stood in front of that same photograph for almost 10 minutes, Richard said quietly, noticing where Marcus was looking. Marcus smiled faintly. He always believed buildings remember more than people do. Richard nodded. He also believed companies become successful because of character before strategy. Marcus continued walking without answering. The boardroom doors opened before they reached them. Inside, 12 directors rose almost simultaneously. Coffee cups rested beside thick binders. Tablets displayed financial reports. The low conversation that had filled the room disappeared the instant Marcus entered. An elderly woman with silver hair stepped forward first. Eleanor Watkins had served on the board longer than anyone else present. She extended both hands warmly. "Welcome, Marcus." "Thank you, Eleanor. Your father would be proud to see you here today." A quiet stillness settled over Marcus for the first time that morning. He glanced briefly toward the city beyond the windows before answering. "I hope I make decisions that would earn that statement." Several directors exchanged approving looks. There was no dramatic announcement. No celebration. Only respectful acknowledgement from people who understood exactly what had changed before the opening bell. Richard placed a folder at the center of the conference table. Ladies and gentlemen, all regulatory filings have been completed. As of 8:32 this morning, Reed Capital officially holds 51% of Sinclair Dynamics. Pens stopped moving. Screens dimmed as attention shifted entirely toward Marcus. He remained standing rather than taking the large chair prepared at the head of the table. Before we begin, he said calmly, I want to make one thing very clear. Every face turned toward him. I did not purchase this company to erase everything it has built. The room remained silent. Thousands of families depend on Sinclair Dynamics. Their future matters far more than today's headlines. Eleanor folded her hands together. What is your first priority? Marcus looked around the table before answering. Listening. The single word seemed to surprise nearly everyone. One director finally spoke. Most majority owners arrive with immediate restructuring plans. Marcus smiled politely. Most majority owners have not spent 20 years watching companies forget the people who make them successful. Richard quietly closed his portfolio, recognizing that the meeting had already taken an unexpected direction. Meanwhile, several floors below, Victoria remained standing outside her office overlooking the lobby through a wall of glass. Employees greeted one another cautiously as they passed. Conversations stopped whenever she approached. Nobody ignored her. Nobody acted disrespectfully. Yet something had undeniably shifted. For the first time since becoming chief executive officer, she sensed hesitation in the building around her. Her executive assistant approached carrying a tablet. Miss Sinclair. Victoria looked up slowly. Yes. There is an email marked urgent from the board of directors. Victoria accepted the tablet without speaking. The message contained only one sentence. Board meeting in progress. Your attendance is requested immediately. She read the line twice before looking toward the private elevator reserved for executive leadership. Just 1 hour earlier, she had believed she controlled every important decision inside Sinclair Dynamics. Now she found herself walking toward a meeting she had not called, inside a company she no longer controlled, carrying the weight of a morning that refused to leave her mind. As the elevator doors closed behind her, one quiet question echoed louder than every accusation she had spoken outside. What if the greatest mistake she had made had begun long before she ever saw the Ferrari? The executive elevator opened with a quiet chime, and Victoria stepped onto the top floor where every decision that shaped Sinclair Dynamics had been made for decades. Usually, employees greeted her with confident smiles, quick updates, and eager questions. This morning, they simply nodded politely before returning to their work. Nobody avoided her, but nobody rushed toward her either. The subtle difference unsettled her more than open criticism ever could. She walked down the long hallway, her heels echoing softly against the polished walnut floor. Through the glass walls, she could see the skyline stretching across Manhattan, bright beneath the autumn sun, unchanged despite everything that had happened below only minutes earlier. Her reflection followed beside her with every step, reminding her of the certainty she had. Carried into the parking lot. It felt strangely distant now. Outside the boardroom, her executive assistant quietly approached. Miss Sinclair, everyone is waiting. Victoria took a slow breath before placing her hand on the brushed steel handle. The heavy door opened smoothly. Every conversation inside stopped immediately. 12 directors sat around the long conference table. Richard Lawson stood beside a presentation screen. Eleanor Watkins reviewed several printed reports. Marcus Reed occupied neither the head of the table nor the chair reserved for the majority shareholder. Instead, he sat midway down one side beside the independent directors, listening as one of the finance officers summarized quarterly performance. He looked up as Victoria entered and offered nothing more than a polite nod. There was no smile of victory, no trace of satisfaction, only professional courtesy. Richard broke the silence. Good morning, Victoria. Please have a seat. She remained standing for a moment. I was not aware this meeting had been scheduled. Eleanor answered calmly. The shareholder agreement permits the majority owner to call a special session with proper notice. Every legal requirement has been satisfied. Victoria slowly took her seat, placing the documents she still carried neatly on the table. The pages felt oddly familiar now, as though she had already read them 100 times without fully accepting what they meant. Richard activated the display behind him. A detailed ownership chart appeared on the large screen. Layers of investment funds connected through several holding companies until every line converged beneath one name. Reed Capital. The final slide appeared. Majority voting interest, 51%. Richard looked around the room. The acquisition closed this morning after 18 months of negotiations. Victoria stared at the timeline displayed beside the transaction. 18 months. Her thoughts immediately began retracing every board meeting, every acquisition proposal, every investor presentation from the past year and a half. Somehow an ownership transition of this magnitude had unfolded without revealing the individuals standing behind it. She looked directly at Marcus. You planned this for 18 months? Marcus answered without hesitation. No. She frowned slightly. Then how long? Almost 6 years. Several directors quietly exchanged glances. Victoria leaned back, unable to hide her surprise. Marcus continued in the same calm tone. Strong companies are rarely built overnight. Neither are responsible investments. Richard added another slide showing steady purchases completed through public filings, private transactions, and retirement funds whose ownership had gradually transferred into Reed Capital. Everything had been transparent. Everything had been legal. Everything had simply gone unnoticed because no one had connected the pieces. Victoria lowered her eyes toward the table. For years, she had believed she understood every major movement involving Sinclair Dynamics. Yet the largest ownership transition in company history had unfolded patiently while she focused on quarterly earnings, market competition, and executive rankings. Marcus folded his hands before speaking again. I did not hide from the company. His voice remained measured, almost reflective. People simply looked everywhere except where they needed to. The sentence lingered in the room. No one responded. Outside the boardroom windows, sunlight drifted across the glass towers surrounding them, while inside another realization quietly settled over everyone present. The morning had never truly been about ownership. It had always been about the assumptions that prevented people from recognizing the man who had been standing in front of them all along. No one reached for the coffee that had already begun to cool beside neatly arranged folders. The quiet inside the boardroom carried a different weight now, not the tension of confrontation, but the discomfort that follows an undeniable truth. Marcus remained seated with his hands folded loosely on the table while the directors waited for him to continue. Outside, sunlight reflected from neighboring skyscrapers, sending brief flashes of silver across the conference room windows. Richard Lawson closed the ownership presentation and dimmed the screen. Mr. Reed, he said, the board would like to hear your recommendations regarding executive leadership. Several directors nodded. Victoria looked up slowly. She knew exactly what that question usually meant after a majority acquisition. A new owner often arrived with prepared announcements, executive replacements, and restructuring plans already approved before the meeting even began. She had witnessed similar transitions at other corporations throughout her career. None had ended kindly for existing leadership. Marcus remained silent for several seconds, studying the faces around the table one by one. He noticed concern, curiosity, cautious optimism, and uncertainty. Finally, he spoke. Before discussing leadership, I would like to ask a simple question. Eleanor Watkins leaned forward slightly. Go ahead. Marcus looked around the room. How many people work for Sinclair Dynamics? The chief financial officer answered immediately. Approximately 18,000 employees across North America. Marcus nodded. And how many of them have ever attended a board meeting? Nobody answered. The silence itself became the answer. Marcus continued. Every decision made in this room reaches 18,000 families. That responsibility should humble every one of us. Victoria listened without interrupting. His words contained no criticism directed toward her, yet she felt each sentence settling heavily in her thoughts. Marcus stood and walked slowly toward the windows overlooking the city. Far below, tiny streams of people crossed intersections, hurried into office buildings, and disappeared beneath the morning rhythm of Manhattan. 6 years ago, he said quietly, I began purchasing shares because I believed this company had extraordinary potential. He rested one hand lightly against the glass. Not because of patents, not because of market share, because of people. Richard smiled faintly, recognizing a philosophy he had heard years earlier from Marcus's father. Marcus turned back toward the table. I visited our manufacturing plants without announcing who I was. I spoke with warehouse teams during overnight shifts. I met receptionists, maintenance crews, engineers, delivery drivers, interns, and retirees. Several directors exchanged surprised looks. None had known he had spent years quietly learning about the company from the ground up. Most of them never asked about stock prices, Marcus continued. They talked about their children, paying mortgages, caring for aging parents, earning promotions, and wanting leaders who noticed them. His voice remained calm, but every word carried quiet conviction. Companies succeed because ordinary people choose to care about extraordinary standards every single day. Victoria lowered her eyes toward the polished table. She remembered the young security guard downstairs. She remembered the receptionist greeting Marcus by name. She remembered how naturally he had thanked every person he encountered. Those moments suddenly formed a pattern she had completely missed. Eleanor finally asked the question everyone had been wondering. So what changes today? Marcus smiled gently. Less than you think. The directors looked at one another. Operations continue. Projects continue. Our employees go to work tomorrow exactly as they planned. Richard raised an eyebrow. Including executive leadership? Marcus met Victoria's eyes for the first time since the meeting began. The room became perfectly still. Leadership is not determined by one difficult morning, he said. It is determined by what someone chooses after that morning. Victoria held his gaze, unable to predict where the conversation was leading. For the first time in many years, she realized the future of her career was no longer controlled by contracts, performance reports, or quarterly earnings. It rested entirely on the character she chose to reveal next. Before we continue, if you enjoy inspiring stories about courage, second chances, and people who choose kindness when it matters most, subscribe to Narralight. Our stories remind us that one decision, one voice, or one act of compassion can change a life forever. Now, let's see what happened next. The room remained perfectly still after Marcus finished speaking. Nobody reached for a pen. Nobody interrupted. Even the quiet hum of the climate control seemed unusually loud against the silence. Victoria sat motionless, her fingertips resting lightly on the stack of documents that had overturned everything she believed she understood about the morning. She had entered the meeting expecting a battle for authority. Instead, she found herself listening to a man who spoke more about responsibility than power. Richard Lawson carefully slid another folder across the conference table toward Marcus. There is one remaining agenda item, he said. Marcus opened the folder without urgency. Inside were several reports prepared by the governance committee, including recommendations regarding executive leadership following the ownership transition. He read each page slowly before closing the folder again. Eleanor Watkins watched him with quiet curiosity. You already know what they recommend, do you not? Marcus nodded once. I do. And? Marcus looked around the room before answering. They recommend appointing a new chief executive officer effective immediately. Several directors shifted slightly in their chairs. Nobody seemed surprised. It was the most predictable outcome after a majority acquisition. Victoria inhaled slowly but said nothing. She had spent enough years in executive leadership to recognize when a decision had already been made. Marcus rested both hands on the table. I have decided not to accept that recommendation. Every face in the room lifted toward him at once. Richard blinked. You intend to reject the governance committee's proposal? Yes. A long silence followed. Even Eleanor appeared genuinely surprised. May I ask why? Marcus answered calmly. Because replacing someone is the easiest decision a majority owner can make. Developing someone is much harder. Victoria looked at him, unable to hide her confusion. She searched his expression for sarcasm, hidden satisfaction, or quiet revenge. There was none. He continued speaking with the same measured voice that had carried him through every moment since arriving outside the building. This company does not need fear today. It needs stability. Richard folded his hands together. Some shareholders may question that decision. Marcus nodded. Some probably will. How will you answer them? Marcus glanced toward the city skyline beyond the windows before replying. By improving results instead of headlines. Eleanor smiled faintly. That sounds remarkably familiar. Marcus returned the smile. My father repeated it often. Victoria finally found her voice. After everything that happened this morning. She paused, struggling to finish the sentence. Marcus turned toward her. Yes. Why would you keep me in this position? The question hung quietly in the air. No accusation. No pride. Only genuine uncertainty. Marcus considered his answer carefully. Because one moment should reveal character, not define an entire life. Victoria lowered her eyes. I made assumptions. You did. I judged you before asking a single question. Marcus nodded gently. You did. She took a slow breath. And you still trust me to lead? Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair. Trust is not something I can simply announce today. His words were calm, but unmistakably honest. It has to be rebuilt. That process begins with choices, not titles. Nobody spoke. The morning sunlight continued drifting across the conference table, illuminating coffee cups that had long since grown cold. Richard quietly closed the governance folder. Then what would you like entered into the official record? Marcus answered without hesitation. Victoria Sinclair remains Chief Executive Officer. He paused before adding one final sentence. Subject to earning the confidence of the people she leads every single day. Victoria looked down at the polished wood reflecting the light from the windows. For the first time since entering the company years earlier, she understood that leadership had never truly belonged to the person occupying the largest office. It belonged to the person willing to examine their own mistakes before judging someone else's. Around the table, the directors slowly nodded in thoughtful agreement, realizing they had just witnessed something far rarer than a corporate takeover. They had witnessed someone choose restoration when retaliation would have been far easier. The meeting adjourned without applause or celebration. Directors quietly gathered their folders, exchanged thoughtful handshakes, and drifted out of the boardroom in small groups. The polished walnut table that had witnessed one of the most significant ownership transitions in the company's history slowly emptied until only 3 people remained. Richard Lawson organized the final legal documents before excusing himself with a respectful nod. Eleanor Watkins paused beside Marcus and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Your father would have approved of the decision you made today. Marcus smiled softly. I hope one day I can say I earned that. Eleanor looked toward Victoria before leaving the room in silence. The heavy door clicked shut behind her. For the first time all morning, the room became completely still. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan continued its familiar rhythm. Yellow taxis threaded through traffic several stories below. Sunlight reflected from neighboring towers, filling the conference room with warm afternoon light that softened the sharp lines of the polished furniture. Victoria remained seated, looking down at the notes she had written during the meeting. None of them seemed important anymore. Marcus quietly collected his own papers, sliding them neatly into a slim leather portfolio. He did not appear eager to leave, nor did he seem interested in extending the conversation. He simply moved with the same calm precision that had marked every action since arriving that morning. Victoria finally broke the silence. May I ask you something? Marcus looked up. Of course. She hesitated, searching for words that felt honest enough. When I accused you outside, were you angry? Marcus considered the question longer than she expected. For a moment, he admitted. Only for a moment. He nodded. Anger arrives quickly. Holding on to it is a choice. Victoria stared quietly at the sunlight stretching across the conference table. I do not think I would have reacted the way you did. Marcus pulled out a chair and sat across from her again. Neither would I have 10 years ago. She looked up with genuine curiosity. What changed? Marcus folded his hands together. Experience. His voice remained steady. When I was 24, I walked into a luxury hotel for a business dinner. Someone assumed I was there to deliver packages. He smiled faintly, though there was sadness behind it. A year later, another employee handed me car keys because they believed I was the valet. Victoria listened without moving. Did you correct them? Marcus nodded. Politely. Were they embarrassed? Usually. He paused briefly before continuing. But embarrassment rarely changes people. Reflection sometimes does. The sentence settled quietly between them. Victoria looked toward the skyline beyond the windows. This morning I never asked your name until the police did. Marcus did not deny it. No. I looked at your clothes, your car, your skin color, and decided I already knew your story. Marcus answered gently. Many people do. There was no bitterness in his voice. That somehow made the confession harder to hear. Victoria slowly removed the company identification badge clipped to her jacket and turned it over in her hands. For years I believed I judged people by performance. She gave a quiet, almost disappointed laugh. Today I learned I judged someone before performance ever had a chance. Marcus leaned back slightly. The difficult part is not discovering a blind spot. He looked directly at her. The difficult part is deciding whether you will leave it there. Victoria met his eyes without looking away. Outside, a faint reflection of drifting clouds crossed the glass, momentarily softening the view of the city below. Inside the room, neither person spoke for several seconds. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt necessary. Finally, Victoria stood and extended her hand across the table. Then I have a great deal to learn. Marcus rose as well. He accepted the handshake without hesitation. So do all of us. As their hands parted, neither executive stood higher than the other. One had gained ownership. The other had gained something far more difficult to acquire: the willingness to question the assumptions that had quietly shaped an entire career. The handshake ended quietly, but neither Marcus nor Victoria reached for the boardroom door. The afternoon sun had shifted farther across the skyline, filling the room with a softer golden light that reflected off the polished conference table. Outside the windows, helicopters traced slow paths above the Hudson River, while streams of office workers hurried through streets that knew nothing about the conversation unfolding several stories above them. Marcus picked up his portfolio and walked toward the windows. He stood there for a moment, looking over the city without saying a word. Victoria remained behind him, wondering how someone who had every reason to celebrate appeared more interested in the view than in victory itself. Finally she spoke. What happens now? Marcus smiled faintly without turning around. Tomorrow morning, 18,000 people will come to work expecting leadership. She waited for him to continue. The question is what kind of leadership they will find. Victoria slowly crossed the room until she stood beside him. The glass reflected both of them against the skyline. Two figures separated by little more than a few inches, yet carrying entirely different versions of the same morning. You could have walked into that parking lot with security, lawyers, and an announcement prepared, she said quietly. Instead, you came alone. Marcus nodded once. That was intentional. She looked at him with genuine curiosity. Why? He rested one hand lightly against the cool glass. Because I wanted to meet the company before the company met its new owner. Victoria frowned slightly. And what did you discover? Marcus answered honestly. I discovered excellent employees. He paused. I also discovered how quickly assumptions can spread when someone important speaks with certainty. The words were calm, but they landed with unmistakable weight. Victoria lowered her eyes. She knew he was not trying to shame her. That somehow made the lesson impossible to ignore. Marcus continued. Do you remember the young security officer downstairs? Yes. He questioned himself the moment new facts appeared. Marcus turned toward her. That is what integrity looks like. It is not being right every time. It is being willing to change when the truth changes. Victoria thought about the frightened expression on the young man's face after realizing what had happened. She remembered Marcus thanking him instead of humiliating him. You protected him, she said softly. Marcus shook his head. No. He protected himself by choosing humility. Silence settled between them again. It no longer felt awkward. It felt reflective, like the quiet that follows an important conversation long after the words have ended. A gentle knock came at the boardroom door. Richard Lawson stepped inside carrying a thin folder. I apologize for interrupting. Marcus smiled. Not at all. Richard placed the folder on the table. The communications department has prepared a draft announcement regarding the ownership transition. They are waiting for approval. Marcus opened the folder and scanned the first page. The proposed statement highlighted the acquisition, praised investor confidence, and introduced the company's new majority owner. He closed it after only a few moments. This will need one change. Richard waited with his pen ready. Marcus looked toward Victoria before speaking. Remove every sentence that talks about me. Richard blinked. Every sentence. Yes. Marcus nodded. Replace them with a message thanking our employees for their work and reassuring them that their jobs, projects, and teams remain our priority. Richard smiled slowly. That is a very different announcement. It should be. Marcus replied. The people in our factories, offices, and warehouses should never wake up wondering whether leadership values headlines more than their future. Richard quietly made the revisions before leaving the room once again. Victoria watched the door close behind him. You keep making decisions I do not expect. Marcus gave a gentle smile. That is probably because expectations are often built from appearances. Victoria looked through the glass toward the parking lot far below, where the crimson Ferrari was now only a small shape against the pavement. She remembered the certainty she had felt that morning, the confidence with which she believed she already knew the truth. That certainty now seemed impossibly distant. She took a slow breath before speaking with complete sincerity. Tomorrow, I want to begin earning back the trust one lost today. Marcus looked at her for a long moment before giving a quiet nod. Then tomorrow will be the first truly successful day this company has had in a very long time. The following morning arrived with the quiet confidence of routine. Sunlight spilled across the glass facade of Sinclair Dynamics, painting long reflections over the plaza where only 24 hours earlier uncertainty had gathered in whispers. Employees stepped through the revolving doors carrying coffee, laptops, and conversations about deadlines, client meetings, and weekend plans. Yet beneath the familiar rhythm, something subtle had changed. People smiled a little more at the security desk. They greeted the reception staff by name. Small gestures that had once been overlooked suddenly seemed to matter. Victoria arrived just before 8 o'clock. For the first time in years, she did not head directly toward the private executive entrance. Instead, she walked through the main lobby with everyone else. The young security officer from the previous morning noticed her approaching and straightened instinctively. Before he could speak, Victoria offered a gentle smile. "Good morning, Ethan." The young man looked surprised that she knew his name. "Good morning, Miss Sinclair." She paused for a moment before continuing. "Thank you for doing your job yesterday." Ethan nodded politely. "I have been thinking about it ever since." Victoria answered with complete honesty. "So have I." She continued toward the reception desk, where the same receptionist Marcus had greeted by name was organizing visitor badges. "Good morning, Melissa." The receptionist looked up with a warm smile. "Good morning, Miss Sinclair." Victoria hesitated briefly. "Actually, just Victoria is fine." Melissa blinked, then smiled even wider. "Good morning, Victoria." The simple exchange lasted only a few seconds, but several employees nearby quietly noticed it. Upstairs, Marcus stood alone in his new office, though little about the room suggested ownership. The walls displayed no awards bearing his name. The shelves remained mostly empty except for a framed photograph of his parents standing outside a small neighborhood grocery store decades earlier. Richard Lawson entered carrying the revised company announcement. "Communications is ready to distribute this whenever you approve it." Marcus read the final version carefully. There was no mention of luxury cars, ownership percentages, or executive power. Instead, the statement thanked employees for their dedication, affirmed confidence in the leadership team, and announced a new company initiative focused on professional respect, fair opportunity, and leadership development throughout every level of the organization. Marcus signed the approval page and handed it back. "This feels right." Richard smiled. "It also feels unusual." Marcus laughed softly. Sometimes unusual is exactly what people remember. Less than an hour later, every employee received the announcement in their inbox. Across offices, warehouses, manufacturing plants, and regional branches, people quietly read the message. Many expected sweeping organizational changes after hearing rumors of the ownership transition. Instead, they found reassurance, stability, and a commitment to treating every employee with dignity. Victoria read the same message from her office. At the very end, one additional paragraph appeared under her name. It announced the formation of a company-wide leadership and respect initiative that she would personally oversee alongside Marcus Reed. She had asked for that paragraph to be included herself, not because anyone demanded it, but because she understood that rebuilding trust required visible action rather than carefully chosen words. Later that afternoon, she knocked gently on Marcus's office door. He looked up from several financial reports and smiled. "Come in." She stepped inside carrying a single sheet of paper. "I thought you should review this before I send it." Marcus accepted the page. It was a personal letter addressed to every employee in the company. There were no excuses inside it. No attempt to shift responsibility. Only a sincere acknowledgement that leaders could make mistakes, that assumptions could harm people, and that real leadership required the courage to learn publicly as well as privately. Marcus finished reading and slowly placed the letter back on the desk. "You do not have to send this." Victoria looked out the window toward the city before answering. "I know." She smiled quietly. That is exactly why I should. Marcus nodded with genuine respect. The sunlight drifted across the office floor as both of them stood in thoughtful silence, understanding that companies rarely changed because of one dramatic meeting. They changed because ordinary people chose, day after day, to become better than they had been the day before. 3 months passed quietly, and the story that employees remembered most was no longer the one that had unfolded beside a crimson Ferrari. It became the story of what happened afterward. Every Monday morning, executives rotated through departments they had rarely visited before. They sat beside customer service representatives, answering calls. They walked warehouse floors before sunrise. They shared lunch with maintenance crews, receptionists, interns, engineers, and delivery teams. The Leadership and Respect Initiative had become more than a company program. It had become part of the culture. Employees who once believed their voices disappeared somewhere between the loading dock and the executive suite discovered that someone was finally listening. Small ideas became meaningful improvements. Quiet concerns became honest conversations. Trust returned gradually, not through speeches or slogans, but through thousands of ordinary moments. Victoria embraced the process with a humility that surprised nearly everyone. She attended every leadership workshop herself instead of simply approving the budget. When new managers joined the company, she personally welcomed them with one lesson she never failed to repeat. Never confuse confidence with certainty. If you stop asking questions, you stop seeing people. She never mentioned the morning that changed her. She did not have to. The lesson lived inside every decision she made afterward. Marcus continued leading with the same quiet consistency that had defined him from the beginning. He rarely occupied the spotlight, preferring to spend time visiting regional offices or meeting employees whose names would never appear in annual reports. He remembered birthdays. He thanked custodians for keeping buildings cleaned before sunrise. He learned the names of security officers, receptionists, and cafeteria workers as naturally as he spoke with board members and investors. People eventually realized that his greatest strength was not owning a majority of the company. It was making every person feel that their work carried dignity. One crisp autumn afternoon, nearly a year after everything had begun, Marcus and Victoria stood together outside the headquarters as employees gathered for the dedication of a new community scholarship created by the company. The scholarship honored students who demonstrated leadership through service rather than status. A simple bronze plaque stood near the entrance, reflecting the afternoon sunlight. It did not bear Marcus's name. It did not bear Victoria's name. Instead, it displayed one sentence. Respect begins before assumptions. Employees paused to read it as they entered the building. Some smiled quietly before continuing inside. Others touched the edge of the plaque for just a moment as though reminding themselves why it had been placed there. Ethan, the young security officer from that unforgettable morning, now supervised the entire security team. Melissa had been promoted to operations coordinator after her ideas improved visitor services across every company location. Neither promotion happened because someone felt sorry for them. They happened because leaders finally learned to notice people they had once overlooked. As the afternoon sun settled lower across Manhattan, Victoria looked toward the same parking area where everything had started. I used to think leadership meant having the final word, she said softly. Marcus followed her gaze. And now? She smiled. Now I think it begins with asking the first question. Marcus nodded, saying nothing else. They stood there in comfortable silence while employees streamed past them on their way home, laughing with coworkers, carrying backpacks, waving goodbye, already thinking about dinner with their families. None of them hurried because the people leading the company stood beside the entrance instead of above it. The city continued moving around them exactly as it always had. Traffic lights changed. Taxi horns echoed in the distance. Reflections of golden sunlight shimmered across the glass walls of Sinclair Dynamics. The world itself had not changed. One company had. One leader had. One heart had. And sometimes that was enough to change thousands of lives that would never know how close they had come to a very different future. Marcus looked once more at the people walking through the front doors and quietly smiled. True wealth had never been measured by the car someone drove, the office someone occupied, or the shares someone owned. It had always been measured by the dignity they chose to give another human being before knowing anything else about them. If this story meant something to you, Subscribe to Narralight for more powerful stories that remind us to look beyond appearances, challenge prejudice, and never underestimate the impact of doing what's right. Because sometimes, the smallest act of courage creates the biggest change. Thank you for watching. Remember, the world changes one choice at a time. We'll see you in the next story.